Good evening, everyone, and welcome if you guys are just joining with us. Tonight I have with me historian John Launius, and we are going to be doing something different again. We like to try these new things on Sundays. Normally it's just a recap of the week and what we've talked about. This Sunday we're going to be diving into some of the books that we have read this week or in the past in 2021, so we're starting from 2021, obviously. And then we're going to go into what we are reading in the future. So things we may have already acquired, things that may have not been released yet, yada, yada, yada. Welcome aboard if you're coming with. I'm going to go ahead and get John in here so we can get going. John, hello, hello.
Yep.
There we are. Hey, how you doing tonight, bud?
Doing all right. How about you?
Doing good, doing good. Let's go. All right, so tonight's topic is really lax, kind of awesome, not nothing too crazy to dive into. We just want to talk about what we've been reading and what we may have on our agenda to read. And in the live stream here, if you're watching it, you're going to see some of the books here that I posted. I put 3 up here that I'm going to, and John, you can pick as many as you want, obviously. But I told him we're starting from 2021, what we have read so far this year, and then what we think about what we've read so far, and then we'll move on to what we are planning to read as the year goes on, things that are released already that we may have acquired or that haven't been released yet that we definitely have our sights on. You already told me that you had a very interesting topic, and because I've blabbed on about Fredericksburg for quite some time, I'll save that for after yours because I think I'm really excited to actually hear what you just read. So I'd like for you to start, if that's cool with you, on what you just finished reading, and I'll tell you what I finished reading afterwards, and then we can talk about the future books. So again, that famous floor is all yours.
Yeah, absolutely. So I literally just today actually finished reading Searching for Stonewall Jackson: A Quest for Legacy in a Divided America by Ben Cleary. Um, and I have mixed feelings about it overall. Um, how to explain this? So I have been sort of on this quest to try and get a better, more complete understanding of the legacy of Stonewall Jackson, and maybe as much as anything else, how that legacy developed. You know, Jackson is very much a Civil War figure that looms large in the historiography. There's probably more books written about Jackson than any other general in the war. If there is someone who has more, it's probably Lee. Uh, he's a figure that looms also very large in the monumentation and the statuary of the Civil War. He's a figure that at various points was used to sell conservation of Civil War battlefields, right? Like they used Jackson's presence at a place or at a battlefield as a way to pull up money to preserve locations. So I've been really interested in this idea of this almost obsession that seems to exist within the Civil War historiography about Jackson. And the title of the book certainly seemed to imply that it was planning to do exactly that.
Right.
And the blurb in the dust jacket. I'll skip to the end where it actually explains what the book itself, where it says, "In searching for Stonewall Jackson, Ben Cleary examines not only Jackson's life but his own, contemplating what it means to be a white Southerner in the 21st century. Now, with statues commemorating the Civil War toppled and Confederate flags torn down, Cleary walks the famous battlefields, following the footsteps of his subjects, as he questions the legacy of Stonewall Jackson and the South's lost cause at a time when the contentions of politics, civil rights, and social justice are at a fever pitch." And the book was first printed and published in 2019, so it's very recent.
Right.
And that sounded like exactly what I was looking for. I had been having a hard time finding stuff that said that this was the angle they were going to take, and so this looked like exactly what I was looking for. It's sold in the Fredericksburg bookshop, which is usually a good sign of a book having solid historical grounding. If it makes it into a Park Service bookshop, so I picked it up and started reading, and unfortunately, I have found myself somewhat let down.
You're let down.
I'm a little let down. And basically because I feel like the book the description of the book promise something that I feel like the book and content did not provide. If that makes sense.
I understand. I think I actually really
So,
understand what you're trying to say there. So it was just not what the title was giving all away. It didn't deliver on what it was essentially promising it was going to deliver on.
yes.
Right.
So I guess maybe I should explain, sort of, I've read the title, I've read the Dust Jacket, but let me maybe explain what it is that I thought I was going to get out of it. I was looking for something that was going to provide a good critical / historical analysis of the legacy of Stonewall Jackson.
Right.
Which is what I've really been looking for. Something that's going to ask serious questions and then explore those questions to their logical conclusions, or logical conclusion or multiple logical conclusions, as the case may be, because there's not always one answer to these things.
Mm-hmm.
And the book did ask at some points, or propose at some points, some interesting questions, but it didn't really seem like the author was interested in actually exploring those questions. They were when they were proposed, they were mostly left hanging.
Mm.
So a good example, I think, of that is when so maybe I should explain sort of the way that the book is structured. And I think the way the book is structured is actually really interesting and one of its strengths, where the author, over the course of writing the book, and apparently it took him 4 years to work on the book. Over the course of those 4 years, as he's researching Jackson, he is simultaneously going to the locations where Jackson fought. He's going to the various battlefields, the various camping grounds, the various headquarters, and so he'll take you through a portion of the history, in 61, 62, 63, whatever, and then bring you sort of forward to what that area is like today. So he talks about Manassas, for example, the Battle of First Manassas, and then we'll move towards talking about walking down to the actual railroad junction in 2015, 2016, whatever it was that he actually made that particular trip.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that structure offers a really interesting opportunity for the kind of critical analysis and introspection that I was looking for. And you see slivers of it, like it's like the basic concept is there. It just never seems to be fully expanded upon. For example, during the section on First Manassas, where he's talking about visiting the park, he sort of mentioned he's sort of talking about the people who are using the Manassas battlefield as green space, as many national battlefields in urbanized areas tend to get used for. They get used just as much, if not more, for their green space than for the historical aspect of the park, because a lot of times it's the most accessible green space within a certain area.
Mm.
And mentioning that he saw I have to double check the book. I can't remember if it's a single person or a group, but I believe it's a single cross country runner who's running through the park for exercise, and he was an African American person, and there's sort of this moment where he starts sort of wondering, what would Jackson have thought of this? This idea of an African American man who is going to school with white people, who and then so it sort of brings up this really interesting question, but then he drops it.
Right. Just kind of completely drops the ball on the whole subject there.
Yeah.
So he almost, are you saying he almost builds it up like he could deliver and then just throws the ball off in the left field?
I mean, I'm not going to go quite that far, because it's not like it's a bad book.
Right.
It's a good book.
Okay. That's a relief.
I just don't think it was accurately marketed, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a good book. So I should add that it is a good book. It is well written. It is clearly well researched. Ben clearly has a passion for the subject. He went to a lot of effort to go to all of these relevant locations. And there is value, I think, in reading this book. I think particularly for people who are relatively new to the subject. You know, if this is maybe one of your first books on Jackson, I think this book would be excellent. Um, but outside that, um, I'm just saying it doesn't. I think it was in. I think it was built up into something that it wasn't, which made it disappointing in the aftermath. Where if it had been more accurately marketed, I think it would have been a lot better. Um, Again, not to say that there aren't some interesting questions that get proposed in here that have that I think will end up sending me in some interesting directions. Like there's a part where he's talking about Jackson in the 62 Valley campaign and moving directly um, into the 7 Days battles. And of course, Jackson's Jackson is famous for his victories in the Valley campaign, but people don't tend to talk as much about how his performance in the 7 Days battles is pretty lackluster. And most of the time when it does get brought up, it sort of gets brought up as like, oh, this was an aberration. This was kind of weird. We don't really know why. Maybe he was just tired, and then it kind of gets brushed off as this one-time aberration. But one thing I think is really interesting that Ben Cleary brings up is this essentially is an idea that I think might actually have a lot of interesting implications, whether he realizes it or not, is that this wasn't an aberration, that this was a inescapable reality of Jackson's command style and personal priorities, and that essentially when you put Jackson on a long campaign like the Valley, which is the better part of 2 months, and then you immediately swing him into another campaign. So he's basically on campaign for the better part of 3 straight months. He basically works himself into catatonia, and to the point of being ineffective, because he refuses to rest. He refuses to take advantage of proper quarters when he has the opportunity to. A lot of these things that, ironically, a lot of people tend to look back at Jackson and think of, oh, these are one of his great strengths. He, never slept inside if his soldiers didn't. He, always refused hospitality from the locals around him. Well, it's like, yeah, that's great up to a point, but when your commanding general hasn't slept in 3 weeks, how
Dude's got to be tired,
is
man.
he going to be?
Right. I mean, there's only so effectiveness you can have when you haven't slept for 3 weeks. I mean, that's ridiculous.
I mean, I'm being a little overdramatic, of course, but
Sure.
you get the idea.
Yeah.
And so I think Cleary brings up this really interesting idea that Jackson, it's just sort of Jackson's nature to go 100% at everything he does. And while that works amazingly well for him in relatively short campaigns, things like First and Second Manassas, things like Fredericksburg, things like Chancellorsville, once you put him on a long extended campaign, he slowly works himself into catatonia, into ineffectiveness. Which in my mind brings up this really interesting idea. People are always saying, oh, what if Jackson was at Gettysburg? What if Jackson was at the Overland Campaign? Well, if you carry that idea to its logical conclusion, the conclusion is, well, that Jackson actually probably wouldn't have done very well during the Overland Campaign, because he would have done the same thing all over again. He would have worked himself into catatonia. And by Cold Harbor, he's not doing any better than he'd be doing at 7 Days.
Right.
So that is, I think, something that's really interesting that Ben Cleary does bring up. So I don't want to, spend the entire time bashing on this book. I do think there's good content here. It's a very readable book. It's a very approachable book. It's just not the rigorous study that I think it sold itself as, and that I was personally looking for.
Right. Well, I appreciate your insight on the book, man.
Hopefully that all made sense.
It made perfect sense, and it helps me to go in. Cause I was going to ask you if it was something you think I should pick up and read and put on my list, my ever-growing to-read list.
I'm going to be honest, if you've done a lot of reading on Jackson already...
Is Robertson, Van Diver, Crick...
yeah, I probably...
Burke Davis...
Honestly, if you've read all that stuff, I'm not sure I would bother.
Copy that, bud. If I did the Stonewall Jackson death site for a while in Chancellorsville. So, and I've wounded Jackson on tour so many times I couldn't even count. So all right, that's a good thing to know, because I was about to say I really don't need to read anything else on old Stonewall there. Especially, well, the only other thing I might dive into here soon, I have the Jedediah Hotchkiss diary, and they make me a map of the valley. That is something that I think anybody just has to read that, because I mean, who wouldn't want to get the idea of the Civil War and like the memoirs from a topographer? He's a topographical engineer too.
Another thing I think I should
give
Cleary credit for is I think he does a really good job of explaining sort of how, in some ways, in certain times, how damaging Jackson's insistence on utmost secrecy was to his own command under certain circumstances. Particularly in the early stages of the Valley Campaign and the 7 Days, mostly in relation to A.P. Hill, interestingly enough, which might explain part of the reason why there was a fair amount of bad blood between A.P. Hill and Jackson. Or there's various moments where Jackson changes plans, which would have mean that Hill needed to do something different, but Jackson made absolutely no effort to inform Hill that plans had changed, or that he was so stubborn with handing information out that when he would speak to guides, he would give the guides the minimum of information they needed, which at 7 Days, on more than one occasion, ended up in him going in the wrong direction, because there were multiple places or multiple roads called by the same name, and he needed to give the guides more information so that they got him to the right Cold Harbor, for example, because there were two Cold Harbors, Cold Harbor and an Old Cold Harbor, and he ends up spending several hours going down the road to the wrong Cold Harbor at one point during the 7 Days, because he just said, "Take me to Cold Harbor," and refused to expand on that any further to the guide.
That's kind of an interesting little take on it too. Now, it's sort of related, sort of not, but have you ever found interest in studying some of the early guides that were actually on our battlefields, like in depth? People like Ralph Happel and some of the other very notable folks. Hell, even Douglas Southall Freeman was given tours on Chancellorsville Battlefield. But I mean, I'm trying to invoke the days of Ranger contact stations on the side of freaking what would now be Route 3 double lane highway, was then a dirt road. Right. And you could stop off in Jackson's Monument. It was like well trimmed, picket fence around it. I mean, these days were like prime visiting battlefield days, of course, in those times. But is that anything that's ever interested you enough to try to study in depth, or no?
Can't say I've looked into that. No.
No.
Though now that you bring it up, it would be an interesting thing to look into.
Next time you make it inside the visitor center of Fredericksburg, there's I don't know if it's still there, but there's a blue binder on the desk. Ask one of them to look at, dude. Oh my gosh, there's pictures of the visitor center from the 40s and 50s. People.
Oh, I know the one you're talking about. I think I have looked through it.
That's one of my favorites. But there's a lot on that at Chancellorsville too. In those bound volumes, you can find pictures of them building the visitor center out here, and a lot of the early monuments that were placed out here at Chancellorsville, and just some of the different images of tours and things that were led on battlefields, all through up the 70s and everything. It's incredible to see some of that and just how it has changed and morphed. Like I said, I know it's a little off topic. When you started invoking the guides, I was just like, oh man, that just kind of threw me to the initial guides of this area here. A lot of them being local battlefield witnesses too. That was incredible to have. The story of Feeney Tapp and Ralph Happel. I'm sure you've heard that, right? Where she just lifts up her fucking skirt and just takes a pee right there on the battlefield, right there talking to Ralph Happel. These are the people that were on the battlefield being first interviewed and giving the initial tours here. So eccentric, so weird. But again, a fun study overall. So it's cool to be able to, when you study the Civil War, find other topics that may not take place during the war and might be, 20, 30, 40 years later down the road. But how important they are to telling the entire story. And I think they need to be incorporated as such in some of these books, when you're doing personal studies like that. I think that would be a cool touch in some of the books. Not saying it's bad that they haven't included it, because maybe it's not something that's been, intensely focused on. But it does kind of just really helped to tell that story even more, to see how it was relayed afterwards and the memory that that invoked for folks that are first coming to these battlefields in the years after the war. Random tangent, sorry, but it just, that was,
No worries.
yeah, thought that was kind of cool.
So now that I'm done with the Cleary book, the next thing on my list is another Stonewall Jackson related book, Inventing Stonewall Jackson,
Oh,
by Wallace Heddle.
interesting.
So I guess I could read the dust jacket for that.
Please and thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Historians' attempts to understand legendary Confederate General Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson have proved uneven at best and often contentious. An occasionally enigmatic and eccentric college professor before the Civil War, Jackson died midway through the conflict, leaving behind no memoirs and relatively few surviving letters or documents. In Inventing Stonewall Jackson, Wallace Heddle offers an innovative and distinctive approach to interpreting Stonewall by examining the lives and agendas of those authors who shape our current understanding of General Jackson. Newspaper reporters, friends, relatives, and fellow soldiers first wrote about Jackson immediately following the Civil War. Most of them, according to Heddle, used portions of their own life stories to frame that of the mythic general. Heddle argues that the legend of Jackson's rise from poverty to power was likely inspired by the rags to riches history of his first biographer, Robert Louis Dabney. Dabney's own success in Presbyterian beliefs probably shaped his account of Jackson's life as much as any factual research. Many other authors inserted personal values into their stories of Stonewall, perplexing generations of historians and writers. Subsequent biographers contributed their own layers to Jackson's myth, and eventually a composite history of the general came to exist in the popular imagination. Later writers, such as the liberal suffragist Mary Johnston, who wrote a novel about Jackson, and the literary critic Alan Tate, who penned a laudatory biography, further shaped Stonewall's myth. As recently as, well, this is longer than I thought it was, as recently as 2003, the film Gods and Generals, which featured Jackson as the key protagonist, affirmed the longevity and power of his image. Impeccable research and nuanced analysis enable Heddle to use American culture and memory to reframe the Stonewall Jackson narrative and provide new ways to understand the long and contended legacy of one of the Civil War's most popular Confederate heroes. Louisiana State University Press, if you were curious.
That is your next upcoming read.
That is my next upcoming read.
Heavy.
Interestingly enough, it appears to be significantly shorter than the last one.
And the last one wasn't that large, was it?
No, it wasn't like, it wasn't a tome. Let's see, the full length was 334 pages. That's not all of that,
That's not bad at all.
And this is significantly shorter, going to be less than half that. 148.
Oh, okay. Yeah, like
Though
my
it is a
land,
smaller type, so we'll see.
I think my landmine book, which I'm talking about tonight a little bit, the one I want to read, is a little bit more or less than that too. It's 165. Yeah.
So we'll see if this one scratches the itch that the other one did not.
That's good. I hope you enjoyed it. And have you read anything in depth on Jackson, or is this like your first kind of like diving into Jackson?
I mean, I've read a couple, some of the biographies. I've read the Robertson biography, for example.
You're a brave man too, man. I understand. Like that was how was that actually? It's from somebody else that has finally told me they've read. You read it cover to cover, right?
The Robertson biography is a tome.
Yeah.
Oh. And is not the most approachable thing.
No. You might as well read the Bible. I mean, it's huge,
lots of solid information, but yeah. It's kind of like reading a textbook. It's very dry. At least that was my experience.
Mine too. How long did it take you?
I think most of my first winter here.
Yeah. It's not. It's not only just because it's so large. It is. He's right. It's so hard to get through. Sometimes you're just like, oh my god. But again, it is textbook written, so.
I mean, it is a very traditional academic text, which they're not read to be page turners. They're not written to be page turners. They're written to have, important historical content in them. And unfortunately, the important stuff isn't always super interesting.
Mm-mm.
Sometimes it is.
Oh, of course.
And more often than I think people realize it is, but not always.
Yeah, that because you got to really have something to grab their attention initially too. And if you start with something like that, it's just not gonna really be the first like, oh man, yeah, this is great.
Yeah, if you're looking for your first book on Stonewall Jackson, searching for Stonewall actually might be a good recommendation because it is so readable and it's so focused specifically on his wartime service. Which obviously for most people is what initially attracts them to Jackson.
Mm-hmm.
Is well, I mean, that's what. But let's be honest, if not for the Civil War, no one would care about Stonewall Jackson. In 29, he'd be a footnote as one of the worst professors in the history of the Virginia Military Institute, and that'd be about it.
Huh. Well, I'm really glad that you're able to grab these books and start reading some more on Jackson. And it's not Robertson, even though we have Michael C. Hardy that says that of the 12 bios I have on Jackson, I like Robertson's the best. And I would agree because I think as dry as it might seem to some, it is still very valuable when it comes to a source. And I think it does give you
absolutely. Like if you're going to read
information.
one biography on Jackson, you should read the Robertson biography.
Oh yeah, no, without a doubt. I have quite a few. I've been through Van Divers. I've been through what's the other one I read? S.C. Gwynn's biography. R.L. Dabney's, which you want to talk about dry. I love Dabney to death, but good God. R.L. Dabney is just... that. And I've had one historian tell me that there was a book that was the cure to insomnia. But I beg to differ. That one right there, that R.L. Dabney book, 100% put you to sleep. But it's still important. But you got to tell it. It's like reading... he said Robertson's is Immaculate Tattooed Historian. Thank you for joining, and thank you for that, because we all agree. Robertson's is top of the line, I think, best Jackson book.
100%, absolutely. Yeah. And, credit where credit is due. I think Robertson got some things right that in the aftermath, in some cases, I think we went back on it and then did more research and found that, no, Robertson actually had it right the first time.
Mm-hmm. And Robertson was an incredible historian himself, so I mean that work speaks volumes. It really does. Well, should we talk about the big old list I've got going on?
Sure.
Yeah, I'm on this daunting task to try and read 4 books at once, and I've actually stopped that in its tracks because a book is set to release on the 9th. That book being the first one there in the picture, which is A Worse Place Than Hell, How the Civil War Battle of Fredericksburg Changed a Nation by John Madison. This book takes such a different approach when it comes to studying a battle, in my opinion. And I'm sure there have been some that have been done very similar. But this one in particular, being that Fredericksburg is home, obviously has a bit of a pull for me to want to read that and really spend some time reading a brand new Fredericksburg book. I have only gotten halfway through because I wanted to try a speed read and get an opinion out before the 9th on the entire book, but because it is so good, I have slow read, and it pays off to read it slow because of the narrative that is written is incredibly easy to pull through and very page turning. You dive deep into a lot of the characters. Now, he weaves the story of 5 individuals. John Pelham, Walt Whitman, Chaplain Arthur Fuller, Louisa May Alcott, and Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. Many of those names, I'm sure, are very familiar, if not all of those names very familiar to most of us. Maybe Arthur Fuller being a little bit lesser, but if you know Margaret Fuller, then, I'm going to let you read the book more and understand that. But yes, this is, 5 major people here that are within our history that are all interwoven stories that meet at Fredericksburg. And these people are coming from around the United States from different types of backgrounds, and One's on the Confederate side, and the rest are going to be focusing more on the Union side. Some not even soldiers at all. I think there's one soldier and one soldier on the Union, one soldier on the Confederacy, and the other's a chaplain that is involved directly with the Army. The others are support of the Army, so they'll be in the book and featured in that realm, in that aspect. But where I'm at so far are just beginning to see Union presence on the banks of the Rappahannock, and I'm almost 200 pages in, and we've just gotten to that point. The beginning 200 pages have been backstories on all five and their involvement into the war.
Interesting.
Yeah. And that alone, the way it's written and the way they describe just some of the characters and, John, Madison has just this incredible way to describe them, and it's something that makes me even want to go back and read some of his other biographies on a few of the people he's written about, because I was like, wow, this is it's just an easy way to read it, and I really like that. And it's the way that they're weaving very slowly to this web of Fredericksburg, and I'm incredibly excited to see how the Fredericksburg battle plays out in the book, and how these characters are going to be able to be portrayed, and what's happening, as it's changing a nation, as the title says, because you can kind of see that too in the storyline, how he's hinting to how the story is going to eventually bring it to a change in the United States overall. But individually, you're getting stories of the soldiers or the participants in this engagement at Fredericksburg, and what their involvement is going to be into the Army, and what that does to them as people.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's what I've gathered so far. And like I said, already I am just solely focused on this at the moment. And Tattooed Historian, thank you for the host, man. That was very nice of you. I appreciate that. But yeah, you have this incredible story that is I don't think it's ever been told before when you bring these lives like this. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
You don't get this type of talk or this type of human interest in depth in a lot of the battlefield studies that we do, or the tours that we go on. And I think as someone who really hasn't taken the time to go into a lot of these, and we've talked about this a few streams ago as well, that it's been a lot of just military maneuver, and troop movement, all of that. Breaking out of that shell and coming into something like this, it really makes you almost feel like you're studying the war for the first time all over again, because it's just a new dearth of information that it's just flooding into your brain with the military maneuvers already on it. So it helps to paint the picture even clearer, if that makes any sense. And I think, again, this should be definitely on the library of anybody that wants to know any human interest of any battle, or let alone if you're just a Fredericksburg fan and you really enjoy that battle. I think this is something you should definitely at least give a shot to and see what you think. And that's just halfway through. I can't wait to see what I say all the way.
To put that on my list as well. I'll be very interested to hear what your final thoughts are when you get through it.
Thank you, man. It's out Tuesday for good. We have it on Tuesday.
Oh, that's right. You got lucky and got it early.
It's okay. So it's at Barnes, and there's 2 more copies at Barnes and Noble.
Oh, they haven't put it away?
Nope. I saw them again.
Interesting.
I almost bought another one because this one was damaged, but I was like, I'm not going to bring it back because I'm going to get one from our store when it comes out so that I can have Madison sign it when they do that event thing and get the book plate for it. Because I would like a signed one too as well, just to have another fresh, not one with a hole. But there is 2-3 copies at Barnes & Noble.
Might have to go pick that up.
Yeah, and like I said, if Frank was right, and he said it was one of the best he's ever read on Fredericksburg. I can completely understand why. I mean, that's on the cover. And I'm going to go ahead, before I finish, I'll go ahead and read since we were doing that earlier, I think that would be cool. And I actually want to read Frank's quote, because it made me, that's kind of what made me want to really buy this, was just how he described it. Quote, Fredericksburg in 1862 became a true touchstone of history. John Madison's genius flows effortlessly through the entire narrative, taking us through the blast furnace of war and its battles and hospitals and its suffering. This is the best book I've ever read on the impact and meaning of Fredericksburg, where ordinary lives were made extraordinary. And that's Francis A. O'Reilly, author of the Fredericksburg Campaign, Winter War on the Rappahannock. And he's giving that accolades. I mean, now Frank wrote the most definitive book on Fredericksburg to date, as we all know, and then that alone is pretty good, I think, complimenting from what John Madison put out.
I remember many a day of going over Winter War on the Rappahannock as an intern in Fredericksburg.
Innocent intern. Oh, yes, that book is like I said, the Bible of Fredericksburg, and I'm glad to have 2 copies, one signed and one that has just been beaten in the field, because it's what I used to take to Fredericksburg every time I go. and I just like to read it while I'm out there. The book jacket here says Pulitzer Prize-winning author John Madison illuminates 3 harrowing months of the Civil War and their enduring legacy for America. December 1862 drove the United States toward a breaking point. The Battle of Fredericksburg shattered Union forces and Northern confidence. As Abraham Lincoln's government threatened to fracture, the critical moment also tested 5 extraordinary individuals whose lives reflect the soul of a nation. The changes they underwent led to profound repercussions in the country's law, literature, politics, and popular mythology. Taken together, their stories offer a striking restatement of what it means to be American. Guided by patriotism, driven by desire, all 5 moved towards singular destinies. A young Harvard intellectual steeped in courageous ideals, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., confronted grave challenges to his concept of duty. The one-eyed Army chaplain Arthur Fuller pitted his frail body against the evils of slavery. Walt Whitman, a gay Brooklyn poet condemned to the guardians of propriety, and Louisa May Alcott, a struggling writer seeking an authentic voice and her father's admiration, tended soldiers' racked bodies as nurses. On the other side of the national schism, John Pelham, a West Point cadet from Alabama, achieved a unique excellence in artillery tactics as he served a doomed and misbegotten cause. A worse place than hell brings together the prodigious forces of war with the intimacy of individual lives. John Madison interweaves the historic and the personal in a work as beautiful as it is powerful. So,
wow.
Yeah, I think like even the book jacket's got a pretty powerful prose to it, so I think that was something that kind of drew a lot of people in as well. So next up,
here's
go ahead.
a question.
Yes, sir.
Before we move on, I got an interesting question. So obviously you haven't finished it yet.
No.
I suppose you haven't actually gotten to Fredericksburg itself yet.
No, they're
or
just
you're
now.
just getting into it.
Yeah.
But as much as I love Frank's book, I've never been convinced that his is the best first book to read on Fredericksburg. It is the definitive book to read on Fredericksburg, at least the battle. But I've not always been convinced it's the best first book to read at Fredericksburg.
Okay.
Do you think this might be a good candidate for that?
No.
No. Okay.
No. The best first book to read on Fredericksburg, I actually recommend 2. You know what? No, I don't. I recommend 3. Before you even get to George Rabel. Well, 3 including George Rabel. So, the first one I would recommend is actually Makowski and White's book.
Oh, yeah.
Simply
all
Murder.
the emerging Civil War books are excellent.
Yeah, I think it's to get you really into the Fredericksburg understanding. Like it's incredible to do that, and I think Simply Murder is among my favorite Fredericksburg books to date too as well. Like that, it is amazing. Second is what's his name? Francis. I think it's Warren E. Juan Jr. or Juan Jr. Fiasco at Fredericksburg. It is a difficult book to find. It used to be at our visitor center, and I made sure I snagged a copy because it's very, very small book. But Fiasco at Fredericksburg, I think, would be my second recommendation because it's a little larger than the ECW book, and it's a little, or actually maybe not even larger. It might be actually be less. But it's a lot more of a narrative without the tour. But the tour is what helps, I think, orient and get you really into a good understanding before you can start diving into something like this. I think this is a good book to read before you read Frank's. Or even after. But I also think that, you really have to, for the Fredericksburg books like that, you really have to really want to read them.
Mm-hmm.
But as a overall outsider that's not trying to get all the history, if you're meeting just someone that's outside of it that might want to read something, I think reading this and pairing it with Simply Murder would be a fantastic experience for somebody that was reading that. I think, because I used to do that a lot with the, when I was studying Chickamauga for the first time, there were 2 books that came out that I really liked. Well, the one was way before I got these. That was the Failure in the Saddle, written by Dave Powell, and that was about Joseph Wheeler and Nathan Bedford Forrest in the cavalry at Chickamauga. And then the other book was recently released, and it was Wittenberg's book on the Lightning Brigade and the fight at Alexander's Bridge at Chickamauga. So as I'm reading Powell's trilogy, I'm starting with the first book, and I'm reading the portion where it comes to Alexander's Bridge. So I stop reading Powell's book, read the big micro history on that actual engagement, and then go back to Powell's book and continue. So I've got an even farther in-depth idea of what's going on at that engagement. If there's something on it that I can do like that, I love to supplement it with what I'm reading so that I've got it going and I can get an even further understanding if it's something that really interests me. Obviously, the Lightning Brigade will interest anybody, you know? So you're going to read it.
Yeah.
Mounted Cavalry is what's up. Mounted Cavalry is dope. And it took them out of getting into the West.
The unmounted cavalry, wouldn't that just make them infantry?
Yes and no. Much different.
I know, I'm just...
I know, it's weird. Okay, I got it. I know. I'm not 1860s, man. I'm relaying what they made. Their common sense, their ideologies. We just discuss it and judge them for it. But we can't really judge them, can we? You ready for the second?
Yeah.
Have you seen the second book before?
I believe I have, yes.
My friend Joe LaFleur recommended this to me, and I've seen a few historians on Facebook actually sharing her daily blog, and I've read what I could here recently, just some of her blog stuff, and it's interested me a little bit. So I decided to go pick this up finally. And
so I believe I actually had this on my Christmas list for the family, but it wasn't one of the things they ended up buying for me. So
we gotta get it then somehow because it looks really good, and I've never gone in to study something like that, and I've even got another one sitting on my shelf, The Fall of the House of Dixie by Bruce Levine, because it's going to be along the same lines. It doesn't treat the lost cause too well, and I mean that's okay because I want to be able to understand a lot of different aspects of what's going on with the war and even afterwards, and just some of the socio-political stuff that's going on. And I figured Heather Cox Richardson would be a great place to start because this one here, How the South Won the Civil War, Oligarchy, Democracy, and the Continuing Fight for the Soul of America. I can read the dust jacket because I haven't really looked into too deep on what this book is going to be fully about because I haven't wanted to. I want to really dive in and understand what she's going to say, so I haven't really researched it. I've just going by what Joe says. He has never given me a book that I didn't like before or recommended me something, so I really do take his word to heart, and if he says it's something I need to read and he's ranting and raving about it, it'll be on my shelf because it's always proven to be very good and very well researched, and that's definitely something I like about you guys' group because everybody knows that we're not going to read some book that has some crappy research in the back. You know, we everybody does really well with picking titles that has very good research and very good footnotes and very reliable sourcing. And I like that because those are books that we all want to keep kind of in circulation, you know.
Absolutely.
Of course. Well, this one says, while the North prevailed in the Civil War, ending slavery and giving the country a new birth of freedom, Heather Cox Richardson argues this provocative work that democracy's blood-soaked victory was ephemeral. The system that had sustained the defeated South moved westward and there established a foothold. It was a natural fit. Settlers from the East had for decades been pushing into the West, where the seizure of Mexican lands at the end of the Mexican-American War and treatment of Native Americans cemented racial hierarchies. The South and West equally depended on extractive industries, cotton in the former and mining, cattle, and oil in the latter, giving a rise to the new birth of white male oligarchy despite the guarantees provided by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and the economic opportunities afforded by expansion. To reveal why this happened, How the South Won the Civil War traces the story of the American paradox, the competing claims of equality and subordination woven into the nation's fabric and identity. At the nation's founding, it was the Eastern yeoman farmer who galvanized and symbolized the American Revolution. After the Civil War, the mantle was assumed by the Western cowboy, single-handedly defending his land against barbarians and savages as well as from a rapacious government. New states entered the Union in the late 19th century, and Western and Southern leaders found yet more common ground. As resources and people streamed into the West during the New Deal and World War II, the region's influence grew. Movement conservatives led by Westerners Barry Goldwater, Richard Nixon, and Ronald Reagan claimed to embody cowboy individualism and worked with Dixiecrats to embrace the ideology of the Confederacy. Richardson's searing book seizes upon the soul of the country and its ongoing struggle to provide equal opportunity to all. Debunking the myth that the Civil War released the nation from the grip of oligarchy, expunging the sins of the founding, it reveals how and why the Old South not only survived in the West, but thrived. That is some heavy stuff.
That's a hell of a dust jacket.
Yes, it is. And like I said, if it's anything like her blogs, man, whew, I'm gonna be taking breaks from that one. Seriously, that sounds heavy, and I'm excited for it. Last but not least, though, I do want to bring up the third book I have in line here. And actually, I should have it reversed because this is coming up after Fredericksburg because I'm just too damn excited for this one because it's so obscure and different as a study. And look at the cover, dude. Like that alone is just like, God, his leg's gone. Like he's stepping on a landmine. It's just
Mines will do that to you.
Yes, they will indeed.
It's kind of what they're known for, in particular. In fact.
Well, anyways, this is known for. Yeah, that sucks. And that's what I'm hoping this book is going to prove here. I mean,
Like, oh, my leg's off.
I don't need the book to prove that landmines suck. I just am excited to be able to read about landmines in the Civil War. Dust Jacket, here we go. It says, despite all that has been published on the American Civil War, one aspect that has never received the in-depth attention it deserves is the widespread use of landmines across the Confederacy. These infernal devices dealt death and injury in nearly every Confederate state and influenced the course of the war. Kenneth R. Rutherford rectifies this oversight with the America's Buried History, Landmines in the Civil War, the first book devoted to a comprehensive analysis and history of the fascinating and important topic. Modern landmines were used for the first time in the history on a widespread basis during the Civil War when the Confederacy, in desperate need of an innovative technology to overcome significant defects in material and manpower, employed them. The first American to die from a victim-activated landmine was on the Virginia Peninsula in early 1862 during the Siege of Yorktown. Their use set off explosive debates inside the Confederate government and within the ranks of the Army over the ethics of using weapons that weight. As Confederate fortunes dimmed, leveraging low-cost weapons like landmines became acceptable and even desirable. The controversial weapon was the brainchild of Confederate General Gabriel J. Rains, who had experimented with explosive booby traps in Florida 2 decades earlier during the Seminole Wars, and other Confederate soldiers developed a sundry of landmine varieties, including command-controlled and victim-activated. The devices saw extensive use in the Virginia, at Port Hudson in Louisiana, and Georgia, the Trans-Mississippi Theater, during the closing weeks of the war in the Carolinas, and in harbors and rivers in multiple states. Debates over the ethics of using landmine warfare did not end until 1865 and are still being waged to this day. Dr. Rutherford, who is known worldwide for his work in landmine discipline and who himself lost his legs to a mine in Africa, relies on a host of primary and secondary research to demonstrate how and why the mines were built, how and where they were deployed, and the effects of their use and the reactions of those who suffered from their deadly blasts. America's Buried History is an important contribution to the literature on one of the most fundamental, contentious, and significant modern conventional weapons. According to some estimates, by the early 1990s, landmines were responsible for more than 26,000 deaths each year worldwide. Landmines, argues Dr. Rutherford, transitioned from tools of cowards and offenses against democracy and civilized warfare to an accepted form of warfare until the early 1990s. The genesis of this acceptance began during the American Civil War. Another heavy one for today. I know. But isn't that just like... I don't know. Something like that sounds like it would be an extremely interesting read, and it would be one that you just would breeze through because it's the interesting... It's got my attention, that's for sure. And I'm like, I almost want to rush through Fredericksburg to start reading about this landmine, but I'm just taking it easy, man. But that's a cool thing, and I think it's going to be a fun topic. So after these Jackson books, do you have anything else that you plan to read or that you know of yet, or is it kind of just up in the air until that happens?
Well, I think the next thing after inventing Stonewall Jackson is well, it was actually a book I tried to order, but the order got canceled for some reason. Let me pull that up right quick. Yeah, like the person I ordered it from, they just didn't ship it for whatever reason. Lee and His Generals in War and Memory by Gary Gallagher.
Ooh.
And again, it's sort of on this same track of me sort of looking at trying to find information pertaining to sort of the legacy of Stonewall Jackson, or not so much information. There's plenty of information on the legacy of Stonewall Jackson, as I'm more looking on analysis of the legacy of Stonewall Jackson. And obviously, this Gary Gallagher is a prolific writer on the Civil War, one of the greats. and he this is one of his. It's not just on Jackson, but obviously it will obviously have a chapter on Jackson. So I'm once I'm done with inventing Stonewall Jackson, want to know with Heddle, I'll probably move on to this one, to this Gallagher book.
That sounds like a very interesting read, man. I think you're gonna get a lot out of that one. I'd like to try to maybe get my hands on
You
that one
also
even too.
promised me I would get to read the Landmine book when
Yes,
you were
I
done
did.
with it, so that's
Absolutely.
obviously on my list as well.
Good. I hope it is because I'm really excited to hear your take on it too. So I'm gonna pass that your way as soon as I'm done. And it won't. I'm telling you, 165 will not take me long at all. That's a train ride, bro. But if I really want to focus it, it's 2 train rides. So it's just the morning and the ride home. But I'll get it done probably Thursday or Friday. So I'll see. So I'll pop into the visitor center Thursday. Maybe I'll even read it earlier. Because I definitely want to pick up some more stuff this week. I don't know exactly what I want to read after those 3. I have 2 that aren't civil. Well, I guess you could say the Stephen Ambrose one is somewhat Civil War related. But the 2 other ones are Stephen Ambrose's Nothing Like It in the World: The Men Who Built the Transcontinental Railroad, 1863 to 1869. I've watched Hell on Wheels quite a bit, and not recently, but just I've seen it twice all the way through, and it was one of my favorite series. And I've always promised myself if I saw this book on a shelf again, I would get it. Well, that was today, and it was only $17. I was like, "Ooh, that's not bad." And it was in my list of wanting to just get eventually and read. And now that I finally got my hands on it, I'm actually pretty like kind of like want to almost stop everything and be like, it's. But I'm waiting. I'm being patient. I'm finishing the 3 that I promised I needed to read first. And then I'm gonna hit Stephen Ambrose's Nothing Like It in the World. And then the other one's kind of, I wouldn't say obscure history, but one that I remember vividly learning about that disturbed me to all hell in middle school that we learned about in American history, and that was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. Do you remember learning about that at all?
Oh, I mean, I don't think I learned about it in school, but I'm pretty sure I know what you're talking
Oh
about.
yeah, they taught me that in middle school, dude. And we're showing us pictures of the corpses of the ladies that were jumping out of the windows, burning, and I'm like, oh,
Well, dude, I didn't go to school in Virginia.
that's good. We did, and that's yeah. So 6th grade me was pretty
My
disturbed.
grade school education was split between Arkansas and Wisconsin, of all places.
Yeah, honestly, in 6th grade, learning about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire was pretty disturbing, dude. So it stuck with me, and I never really dove into it any further than a Wikipedia ad. And I saw a book that said Triangle. I said, "There's no fucking way that's what I think it is." And I picked it up, and sure enough, it was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire book. I was like, "All right." New York Times Book Review says it's a notable book, so it's not a bestseller, but it's up there. And I mean, I read through it a little bit and looked up the review before I picked it up, and I saw that Bob Woodward, who's one of, honestly, an idol of mine. I actually really like Woodward. Every good, great reason possible. But he wrote a good review, and I shouldn't always base my buying habits off of people that I really, really like's good review, but honestly, I tend to, because it's almost like a recommendation from them, if you will. And I'm just like, okay, if they say it's like that, then it's something I would want to read. And I'm excited to get, like I said, a little more in depth into the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory story, because it's very sad and very, very kind of heartbreaking. But are you familiar with what happened, John?
I mean, maybe only in the vaguest sense.
So, I think this is like the birth of OSHA, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, not really, but I think it sort of does play along the lines of that. But pretty much the conditions that these ladies were working in were not fireproof, and they were working at a very top of a building. Well, and they decided to lock the doors, too, during working hours, so that people couldn't leave.
That's what I thought this was.
And well, a wastebasket caught fire, and being that it's a seamstress plant and everybody's making cloth, it goes up in flames, and they're trapped, and they start jumping windows, and there's like 100 something victims of that fire, including victims. There was like 32 victims that were on a fire escape that collapsed. A very nightmarish scene for early New York. At least in the 1912s, 1913, or 1911, specifically 1911. But yeah, it was very, very, very horrific. And I mean, the opening, I just read the prologue before I even bought the book, and it was talking about the identification process walking through a pier. And then not being able to recognize them because of the burns. And then they were like, oh, well, let's just say it's our daughter. And then they'd go home and sleep on it, come back the next morning and take the tags back off, and the body goes back out for identification like 10 times. And it's just people doing that over and over again. Oh man, this is a little bit deeper than I thought it was going to be. So it's interesting to see different aspects other than Civil War. Obviously, a lot of us do read other things, and again, I'm on a mounting pile of to read stuff that those two have been added as well. And I think I'm just keeping with this because the ones that I've had in that big picture are they're on. I have my own specific to read shelf now, but I'm like I have just a set pulled, and I'm gonna let them stay that I have pulled. I'm not gonna add anything else to this. If I acquire anything else, it goes on the shelf. So it's my first attempt at organizing a read. You know, I've got 4 books here that I can, or 5, excuse me, that I can breeze through in 2 weeks, and then put them back on the shelf and rotate out 5 more. I think that's how I'm going to start doing things. Let's hope that works, because some books are.
Good luck.
Yeah, like I've tried many approaches at this, and this is the latest approach, and we'll see how it goes. I have faith and I have no faith at the same time. On that note, everybody, we are 2 minutes out from 8:30, so I think we're just going to keep this at a solid hour because it was a great show. We were really glad to talk about books for once, and I think maybe, with our reading habits, we can probably do this either once a week or bi-weekly, so once every 2 weeks. That way it gives us some time to cram all these books in because, life happens too, and sometimes we don't get around to reading as much as we think we can. So I think maybe bi-weekly would be something that's more appropriate.
Yeah, either bi-weekly or monthly would probably be best.
Yeah, monthly is even a good. Yeah, monthly's not a bad idea. What is it? This is the first week of the month, right?
Yeah.
All right, we'll just do it the first Sunday of the month.
Yeah, it's the first Sunday of the month.
Let's see that first Sunday of the month. We'll start that first Sunday of every month. We'll do a recap on our reading and what we've been reading. So, you've seen what this month's reading is so far. I'll throw some more book plugs in there when I can, and when this is posted too, we'll have links in all the different websites. If it's a Sabbath BD book, you're buying it from them. We'll send you their website. Any other books there that we can find on Amazon, we'll send you them that way. John, any closing remarks? Good, sir.
Just stay safe out there, folks. With all the weather going around.
I'm glad the snow melted today here pretty quickly. That was nice to know that I can drive to work tomorrow with relative comfort.
Yeah.
Not worrying about it being icy. And again, guys, I want to thank you all so much for joining us on a Sunday. We will be back tomorrow with some good stuff. We will see you then.